Hey everybody, Matt here for Imagine Then Make. Thanks for stopping by. Well, I'm really excited to start a new series of videos that documents my learning journey. Yes, I'm learning Blender. I'm making a full court press and finally going to buckle down and learn Blender. I've tried before, found it very frustrating, but after a whole bunch of software rewrites and updates, I think Blender is now a lot easier for people like me to learn how to use. I'm planning to use it to draw in 3D and also animate. Since I'm a woodworker, that's the perspective I'm coming from. So if you're interested in any of that, stick with me and let's learn Blender together. Oh, and before I forget, I am self-aware enough to know that sometimes the pace of my videos is just too slow for people. So if that's you, I won't be offended. Go ahead and use the settings in your YouTube app. I think on the desktop it's down below and on mobile it's up top. Just open up the settings panel, choose playback speed, and choose a speed that's more comfortable for you. I won't be offended, I promise. Oh, yeah, and one more thing I want to say before I start going here with Blender, and I promise I'll stop rambling. These videos are intended for absolute beginners, but to be completely transparent with you, I am not what I would consider an absolute beginner with regards to drawing on a computer, either in 2D or 3D, and even doing some animations, in particular in 3D. I've used lots of different programs, mostly having to do with either my education or my day job that I held at the time. But Blender is still rather unique. And honestly, I gave Blender a half-hearted attempt many years ago. And in fact, I'll show you the one video I was able to create. It took me a long time to create this because at that time the user interface for Blender was what I thought very difficult. It was not very intuitive and it was so different than anything else I had used. I'm running primarily on the Windows platform, 99.9% of the time on the Windows platform. And so I was used to running Windows programs that kind of all look and feel more or less the same. And Blender is just not that, at least back then. So along the way, I've most recently, and if you check my YouTube video, all the videos that are on my YouTube channel, I started in 2017, and along the way, you've seen me use a program called LibreCAD, which is a 2D drawing program. It's also free and open source. That's one of the things that attracted it to me. But also, that program in particular allows me to draw very, very precisely, and I can also make printouts very, very precisely. So when I rediscovered using the scroll saw in my wood shop, making paper templates for things that I wanted to cut out of wood, that was right up LibreCAD's alley. Perfect application for that. But it doesn't do 3D and it doesn't do animation. So from my prior experience trying to learn how to do Blender back in the old days, I kind of gave up on Blender because it was just too difficult, I felt, for me to learn how to use. I felt like I'd have to spend too much time. So after LibreCAD, I started looking for another 3D drawing program that was easy enough to learn and yet something I could get proficient at reasonably quickly and get down to making projects. And that's when I found SketchUp. Now, SketchUp was a program that was originally started by Google. If you're not aware, I'm not sure if it was called SketchUp at the time, maybe not. And then later on, Google sold it to a company called Trimble, I think. And at the time, when Google had it, it was a free-to-use program, so anybody could learn to use SketchUp or whatever it was called to draw in 3D. And it was aimed mostly at the architectural market, people that were drawing houses and that sort of thing. And then when Trimble bought it, it still remained free to use, but eventually over time, in order to use the most recent version of SketchUp from Trimble, you had to buy a license, so it was no longer free to use. Now, in defense of Trimble, they did put a version of SketchUp, I think it's called SketchUp for the web, online, which you can use for free. And it's actually pretty capable, and it's fun like SketchUp is fun to use. There's a few gotchas, as with any piece of software. If you've tried using different programs over the years, you've probably run into hiccups and things that are a little bit frustrating or unintuitive to figure out how to do, but we all work past that and continue using these software programs. So when Trimble decided to go to a subscription-based license, I wasn't really interested in that, so I went back to Blender to see if Blender had become easier to learn and use, and I was very happy and not really surprised, because if you're not aware, Blender is under constant development. Okay, and there's a whole story behind that and how Blender is funded and so on. That's what keeps Blender at this point open source and free for everyone to use. So I took another look at Blender after Trimble decided to start doing a subscription service for SketchUp. And I found that Blender was a lot easier to learn and use. So that's what started me on my current quest to sort of relearn, if we want to say that, relearn how to use Blender from a woodworker's perspective. Now, again, if you flip through all the videos on my channel, you'll see me making stuff primarily out of wood and sometimes out of cardboard. And most of the time, I either do a pencil sketch for what I want to make, or I draw it up in LibreCAD, or I draw it up in SketchUp. And there's videos on my channel that show me doing that. Now I want to migrate to Blender. So you might be wondering, well, why do you want to learn Blender if SketchUp's so great? Well, SketchUp is great. I don't want to give you any misinformation there. I really like using SketchUp, but in order to use the most current version, you have to pay for a license, and that's the part I don't like. So took another look at Blender, and one of the things that's really attracted me to Blender is that I should be able to draw the kind of drawings that I want so that I can continue to make projects out of wood or cardboard as I have been doing. But in addition, Blender gives me the ability to actually animate the parts. So now I've become more interested in making projects with parts that move. Now you can probably do that with SketchUp, although you probably need to add an extension, which is a way to add functionality to SketchUp. There's a whole bunch of free extensions that you can get from SketchUp, but here's the catch. The extensions only work with the downloadable version of SketchUp, and the last downloadable free version of SketchUp is called SketchUp Make 2017. So it's getting a little long in the tooth now. It's about 5 years old. They're not updating it or even supporting it anymore. What they're really updating and supporting for free is the SketchUp on the web application. If you want to use a downloadable version of SketchUp, then you're going to have to pay for a license, which I said 3 times already that I'm not really interested in doing. So SketchUp, as far as I know, doesn't have any inherent abilities to do animations, but Blender does. And in fact, Blender includes a video editor. It also includes a shader. It includes rigging and all sorts of other things like sculpting. So there's like no end to the things you can do with Blender. And because it's open source and going to be free to use forever, again, because of the way it's funded by through the Blender Foundation. And if you're interested in learning more about that, hop over to Blender's website, blender.org, or just Google it and check out Blender's history. It's actually kind of fascinating. It's been around for a long time, and it's gone through a lot of iterations and development, and it's really quite amazing for a free piece of software. All right, so that's the long rambling story about how I got to where I am right now, and that is wanting to relearn how to use Blender from a woodworker's perspective. All right, if you're still with me, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Now it's time to hop over to Blender's website where you can download Blender. I also want to show you around a little bit because maybe there's some things you're not aware of. All right, today is March 9th, 2022, and this is Blender's website. You can get to it by going to blender.org. I mentioned before, but it bears repeating, Blender is under constant development and evolution, so by the time you log into blender.org, this webpage might look a little bit different. Right at the top of the page is this Download Blender button. We'll come back to that in a minute. As I scroll down the page, there's lots of information about Blender, and in particular, I want to call your attention to this big black box right here. It's labeled Free and Open Source. Blender is a public project hosted on blender.org, licensed as GNU GPL, owned by its contributors. For that reason, Blender is free and open source software forever. So besides all the wonderful things you can do with Blender, both in 2D and in 3D, the fact that it's under constant development, because it is indeed open source software and people all around the world use this program every day, and the fact that it's free for anyone to use, these forever, those are all things that really attract me to Blender. So as I continue to scroll down the web page, there's more information. They start to list some of the big pieces of functionality that's built into Blender, and it's mind-boggling how much stuff there is built into Blender. It's pretty amazing for a free-to-use program. All the way down at the end of the page, you see a whole list, a footer that has a whole bunch of other links that are worth perusing at your leisure. At this particular moment, I want to call you to this previous versions link. If I click on that, it lists this, brings up this previous versions page, and then over here it says all previous versions. Every release is available for download. Your old files are safe. So if I click on the download link, and I kind of take a second here to resize this page just to make it a little easier for you to see as I'm screen recording. Every release of Blender, starting with Blender version 1, is listed right here. And you can see that Blender 1 was active, went through some rapid development in the very early days, and quickly morphed into Blender 2. And then Blender 2 was the standard for a number of years, and you can see it went through all kinds of updates and expansions, and finally concluded at Blender 2.93. Then in January of 2022, this year, January 26th, Blender 3.0, the next major release, was released. And then today, coincidentally, March 9th of 2022, Blender 3.1 was released. So again, this just kind of emphasizes and double underlines the idea that Blender is under constant development and evolution. It's one of the things that really attracts me to Blender. So if I navigate back to the home page and scroll all the way up to the top, I get back to this Download Blender button. If I click on that, it brings me to a download page. I think because I'm on Windows, the web page probably knows that, so it puts this Download Blender 3.1, which is the latest release, as I just mentioned. It puts this Download Blender 3.1 for Windows right here front and center, but there are other versions for the Mac OS and Linux. And then right under here, I want to call your attention to this text. It says, looking for Blender LTS. It's a smaller font and a little bit grayed out, so it's maybe a little bit difficult to read, but there it is. So if I click on that, we quickly learn that LTS stands for long-term support. And so what that means is that the Blender LTS program is aimed at ensuring that long-lasting projects, like making short or full-length animated movies, which take quite a lot of effort and can take a long time to complete. Those kinds of long-lasting projects can be executed using a stable Blender version, which will provide critical fixes throughout a 2-year time span. The LTS version will not have any new features, API changes, or improvements. Any critical fix that is applied to the 2.9 series, which is up here, will be regularly ported over to the Blender 2.83 LTS, which is over here.
And you can see Blender 2.83 LTS will continue to get support and fixes until June of this year, 2022. Whereas Blender 2.93 LTS will continue to get official support until 2023. So because I want to create a bunch of tutorial videos for all of you using a version of Blender that's not going to change, I've decided to use Blender 2.93 LTS as the foundation for my video series. So if I click on the Read More link, it brings me to 2.93 long-term support page. If I scroll down a little bit, it brings us to the changelog. And here we can quickly learn that LTS release 2.93.8 is the latest version, and it was released on February 2nd of this year for all of the major operating systems. For Windows users such as myself, there's a Windows installer, and there's also a link to download a portable zip file. So if I click on the Windows installer, then it opens up a download folder. And once I click on save, that's the file that gets downloaded to my download folder. It's called Blender-2.93.8-Windows-x64. And it's the Windows installer version, not the zip file. So right in the name of the file is the version of Blender that I'm using. Windows is the operating system this version is running under. And 64 just means it's 64-bit. To install Blender, all I do is double click this, and then the installer builds a Blender 2.93 folder inside of a Blender Foundation folder, which is inside my Program Files folder, which is right on my local hard drive on my PC. So it's right in this Blender 2.93 folder that you find all the files needed to run 2.93. So if I want to launch Blender from here, I can just double click blender.exe. Blender launches, and notice it launches pretty quickly, and it shows this splash page and the splash screen. And right at the top right hand corner of the splash screen is the version number 2.93.8. So if I left mouse click anywhere in the viewport, which is this area of the user interface, we'll talk a lot more about the user interface in upcoming videos. If I left mouse click, the splash screen goes away, but you can still see the Blender version down here, 2.93.8. So hopefully I've given you more than enough information to navigate to Blender's website and download a version of Blender. I hope you stick with me and choose to download the 2.93.8 version. I think it'll make it easier for you to follow along with my screen, because it should be reasonably easy to have both of our screens look the same. And when you're just starting to learn how to use Blender, I think that will be really useful for you. So what if you don't want to navigate all the way to the 2.93 folder and then double click Blender? Well, you could create a shortcut, at least in Windows. So if I right click this and say create shortcut, Windows gives me a little alert here that says Windows can't create a shortcut here. Do you want the shortcut to be placed on your desktop instead? So I say yes. And there's my new shortcut. So if I double click this, it launches Blender, and again you can see it's 2.93.8, 2.93.8.
So in the next video, I'm going to show you the user preferences I've selected for Blender. You can also use the same user preferences as I am. That might be useful because then our screens would more closely match, and that might make following along with the videos a little bit easier for you. We're also going to start taking a look at the user interface for Blender. There's a lot going on here, so I'm going to really try to simplify it and also demystify it.